In 1929, something began in southeastern Nigeria that colonial authorities did not expect. It did not begin with soldiers, it did not begin with weapons. It began with questions. And those questions were asked by women. The events would later be called the Aba Women's War. But at the time, it was simply women refusing to accept a system that had begun to threaten their lives and livelihoods. The protests began in and around the town of Aba, during a period when the region was under British colonial rule. For years, colonial administrations had governed local communities through a system known as indirect rule. Instead of ruling every village directly, British officials appointed local intermediaries, often referred to as warrant chiefs. But the system created tension. Many communities felt that these appointed leaders did not truly represent them. And for women, the situation became even more complicated. Traditionally, women in southeastern Nigeria had their own political influence within their communities. They participated in markets, organized collective actions, and had systems for holding leaders accountable. Colonial rule began to disrupt these structures. Traditional systems of governance and culture were undermined. Then in 1929, rumors spread that colonial authorities planned to extend taxation to women. At the time, men were already being taxed. For many families, those taxes were already difficult to pay. If women were also taxed, it would place an even greater burden on household. The rumor alone was enough to create alarm. In one community, a colonial census officer began counting property and livestock. To local women, the counting looked like preparation for a new tax. Soon, word began to spread. Messages traveled from village to village. Women gathered in markets, meetings were held, songs were sung. The protests that followed were organized through traditional methods of collective action. Women traveled in large groups. They surrounded the homes of warrant chiefs. This form of protest had deep cultural roots. In many communities, women used collective demonstrations to challenge authority when leaders were believed to be acting unjustly. But this time, the protests were directed at the colonial system itself. Thousands of women joined the movement. What began near Aba spread quickly across the region. Markets closed, administrative offices were surrounded. Crowds demanded that the census stop and that new taxes be rejected. Colonial officials were alarmed by the scale of the demonstrations. To them, the protests looked like rebellion. But the women saw something different. They believed they were defending their communities. At several locations, tensions escalated. Colonial forces were sent to disperse crowds. In some places, gunfire followed. Multiple women were killed. The exact number remains debated by historians, but the impact was undeniable. The protests shook the colonial administration. Authorities launched investigations into what happened. In the years that followed, some policies were adjusted. Colonial officials began to reconsider how they governed the region and how they interacted with local communities. The events of 1929 became one of the largest anti-colonial protests in West Africa during that period. But the story is not only about confrontation, it is also about organization. The women who participated were not soldiers. They were traders, farmers, mothers, and community leaders. They used methods of protest that had existed in their societies long before colonial rule. Through coordination, collective voice, and determination, they forced a powerful administration to pay attention. Today, the events remembered as Aba Women's War remain an important chapter in the history of resistance in Nigeria. It showed that opposition to colonial rule did not always begin with armies. Sometimes it began with communities asking questions, and sometimes it began with women saying no.